I gained stereo vision when I was 48 years old. And you'll learn as I go through the talk that I was basically cross-eyed through most of my life, from the time I was just a little bitty baby, a few months old on. And I was stereo blind, and I didn't see in stereo until I was 48 years old and underwent a course of optometric vision therapy with a developmental optometrist. And I'm going to describe how I learned to see in 3D. Other background information about me is that I'm a professor of neurobiology at Mount Holyoke College in the rainy area of South Hadley, Massachusetts. And I've just written a book called Fixing My Gaze, A Scientist's Journey into Seeing in 3 Dimensions. And I do have a few more copies of the book for sale. So if after the talk, if you're interested in purchasing a copy, and I'll be reading a little bit from it, just let me know. And the book costs $20, which is a bargain. It's $26 plus tax in the bookstores. Okay?
Great title.
Thank you. Thank you. I won't bore you with the amazing argument I had with the publisher over the title, but both agreed that I came up with Fixing My Gaze, and they said they liked it, and my optometrist liked it because she said, you know, it sounds doable. So why don't I get started? Well, I am a biology professor, and so the first slide that I wanted to show you was of an animal. And does anyone know what this animal is? This is a sea squirt, or a tunicate. And these are actually animals that are part of the same phylum, the chordates that we're part of, the same phylum that other vertebrate animals are part of. And so I find this very curious that here's our cousin, a tunicate. And when it is young, in its larval stage, it swims about, and it has a tadpole-like appearance. And it has 2 eyes in the front of its head, and the eyes have lenses. And presumably it forms an image. By the way, for those coming in, there are 3 things you should have for this talk. One is a piece of paper with the following picture on it. One is a bead with a string. And the third is the Polaroid glasses. And we'll use these 3 things throughout the talk. Okay, so this is a sea squirt. And that's its larval form. And when it swims about and it finds a place that it likes to live, it literally sticks its head in the sand and metamorphoses into the adult form of the tunicate, which looks like this. Kind of like one of those water bottles that you might put on your stomach if you have a stomachache. Kind of look. And it basically turns into a filter feeder, where it takes in water through one opening and out the other and strains out the plankton that it likes to eat. So why do I mention this? The reason I mention the tunicate is when it is in its larval form and it's swimming about, it has 2 lens-forming eyes and a somewhat vertebrate-like brain. When it converts to a filter feeder and no longer moves, just sits in the water and filter feeds, its lens-forming eyes degenerate, and so does its brain. And the point of it is that if you don't need to move, you don't need a good set of eyes in the brain. That the major role of vision is to allow us to move with accuracy and to manipulate objects with accuracy. And to do that, we need to know where we are in space and where other things are in space. And that's the major role of vision, to let us know where we are in space. Okay? And if you understand that, then you can begin to understand the condition I had, crossed eyes, the adaptations to it, and how I was able to learn at the age of 48 how to change the way I use my eyes to see in stereo. Okay? So, how do we know where we are in space? First of all, I want you to imagine that you don't have 2 eyes. You have one large cyclopean eye right in the middle of your forehead. Now, assuming your head were straight and your body were straight, you would know, for example, that, let's say, this book is to your right, or it's to my right, let's say, because I have to turn my cyclopean eye to the right. I would know that Mr. Green here is right in front of me because I have to turn my cyclopean eye straight ahead to see him. So where the eye points is where you are looking, and where things are would be then dependent upon where the eye is pointing. Or you could figure out where things are by where the eye is pointing. But we don't have one eye, we have two. And so I want you to do this little experiment. Take your index finger and just stick it in front of your face and look at it. And let me ask you this. You are looking straight ahead, but is either eye looking straight ahead? No. No. Your right eye is turned leftward, and your left eye is turned rightward. Neither eye is pointing straight ahead, and yet your impression is, I am looking straight ahead. What is straight ahead is where the line of sight of the two eyes crosses. So these solid lines here, going from, let's say, the object, in your case the finger, to the back of the eye, to the retina, to the center of the retina, the fovea, the place where you have your highest acuity vision. These straight lines intersect at the target, where you are looking. So neither eye is pointing straight ahead, and yet your impression is you're pointing straight ahead. Not only does this target fall on the back of the retina. So here we have two eyes. They're looking at a block. The block is falling on the central part of the retina of both eyes. The image of the block is falling on the central part of the retina of both eyes. That means the image of the block is falling on corresponding parts of the retinas of the two eyes. And your brain then says, aha, this block image, I have one in my right eye and one in my left eye, but the image is falling on the corresponding point of the retina of the two eyes. So even though I have two images of the block, there is only one block, and it's located in one unique location in space, in this case straight ahead, where the line of sight of the two eyes crosses. Similarly, this teddy bear, which is about in the same plane as the block, frontoparallel plane of the block, if you follow these dotted lines, it's also falling on corresponding points of the two retinas. It's falling on the right of the fovea of both retinas, the fovea being the central point, and it's falling the same number of degrees to the right for both the right and the left eye. And so your brain says, aha, I have two images of a teddy bear, but they are falling on corresponding points of the two retinas. And so therefore, there is only one teddy bear, and it's located in one unique location in space. And the same, of course, is true for the rattle, which is falling on the left side of both retinas. So we judge that an object is single if its image falls on corresponding points of the two retinas. It's not the only time we judge something as single, but certainly that's one computation that our brain makes. And interestingly, and if anyone was interested, I could talk about this a little bit after the talk, strabismics don't always make that assumption. Okay, and so this ability to align the eyes so that images fall on corresponding retinal points is, of course, brings us stereopsis, and I really don't think I need to review the mechanism of stereopsis with this crowd. But, basically, I think it's a little bit hard to see, but in this picture, the two eyes are aiming at a point called fix. And therefore, the point fix, its image is falling on corresponding central points of the two retinas. The image called target, you know what, if we lowered the lights in this part of the room, do you know how to do that? Well, whatever. The image called target is falling on non-corresponding points of the two retinas. Here's the central point of the two retinas. The target image is falling to the right in both these retinas, but the number of degrees to the right is different for the right and left eye. In this case, the brain does make the assumption that there's only one target. But because it's falling on non-corresponding points, it's not located in the same plane as where you are looking. It's not located in the fixation plane, but it's located, in this case, because of the relative position on the two retinas, behind the fixation plane. Mm-hmm. Similarly, a target that was located somewhere in front of the fixation plane would also fall on non-corresponding points of the two retinas, and the relative position of those points would tell the brain that image is in front. And that is, the basic idea behind stereopsis. Okay? All of this is predicated on one important skill, the ability to point the two eyes at the same place at the same time. And when I wrote my book, my editor goes, "I'm tired of that phrase." And I ended up taking it out in a number of places and then leaving it where it was most important to say it. Point the two eyes at the same place at the same time. Why is that such an important concept? Because if you are cross-eyed, as I was, you don't point the two eyes at the same place at the same time. So these are pictures of me when I was a little baby and when I was a toddler. And when, in this picture you can see, I am looking at the world through my right eye, and the left eye is turned in. In this picture, I'm looking at the world through my left eye, and the right eye is turned in. So one eye is looking straight ahead, and the other eye is looking someplace else. They're not pointing to the same place at the same time. An image is not falling on the corresponding points of the two retinas. The image that I'm looking at is not falling on corresponding points of the two retinas because I'm looking at it only with one eye while the other eye is turned in. Okay? Well, what happens if that's the situation? What is the brain going to do with that information? And basically, a person who has crossed eyes or wall eyes, exotropia, which means one eye looks straight at the object and the other eye turns out, a person who has these misaligned eyes is going to suffer from two visual problems. One is double vision, which I'll get to in a minute, and the other is visual confusion. So has anyone heard the term visual confusion? You guys know that term? It was actually coined by Hermann von Helmholtz, the great scientist, the great perceptual, well, he was physicist, scientist, inventor of the ophthalmoscope, an amazing man, okay? He termed the coin visual confusion. He coined the term. That's been interesting. Is that like confusing? So he termed the coin. Anyway, maybe there's like something there. Anyway.
Verbal confusion.
Right. So what do I mean by visual confusion? I mean this. Let's say this person's left eye is pointing at the rattle. The person is looking at the rattle with the left eye. That means the left eye's image is falling on the central foveal part of the retina. But this eye, the right eye, is turned in. It's not seeing the rattle. Instead, the image that's falling on the central foveal part of the right eye is the block. Because the two eyes are pointed at different things. Now, if the brain assumes that images that fall on corresponding retinal points are found in the same place in space, what you have then is that the block, which is falling on the central retina here, and the rattle, which is falling on the central retina here, will appear in the same place in space. The block and the rattle will overlap, and that's what's called visual confusion. This is an untenable situation. You have to find some way to get around visual confusion. Now, if you want to imagine what it's like, take the piece of paper that I gave you, roll it up into a tube about the size of a toilet paper tube so that you can look through it with one eye, like I spy. Then take your free hand. So if you're looking through the tube with your right eye, take your free hand and put it up against the tube. Don't block the tube. Don't do this. Put it up against the tube with the palm facing you. Palm facing you. Put it up against the tube like this. And now open both eyes, and what do you see?
A hole in my hand.
Anybody in pain? You've got a hole in your hand. That's visual confusion. Think about what's happening. Your right eye is seeing the hole, the image of the hole, or what's through the tube. It's falling on the right eye's retina in the same place that the image of the hand is falling on the left eye's retina. And as a result, your brain interprets those two images as coming from the same place in space, and you see a hole in your hand. So this is a problem that's going to happen if you have crossed eyes. And when I was in school just learning to read, I had a lot of visual confusion. The letters would move about on the page. And I had a hard time learning to read as a result. Okay. There's another problem, of course, that happens if the eyes are not pointed to the same place in space. And that's double vision, or diplopia. So what you want to think about here is, for example, that the rattle, which is falling on the central part of the, whose image is falling on the central part of the left retina, that same rattle is casting its image on a non-central, non-foveal part of the right retina. So now the rattle is appearing on two non-corresponding points of the two eyes, the two retinas, and the brain may make the interpretation that there's not one, but there are two rattles. And these two rattles are located in different places in space. Okay? And so you have double vision. Well, when I was a child, my esotropia, my crossed eyes, developed so young, within the first months of life, which is the earliest time that esotropia can happen, that I learned to cope with this situation by suppressing the input from one eye. So basically, I would look at you, let's say, with my right eye and turn the left eye in. But the next moment, or with the next glance, I might look at you with the left eye and turn the right eye in. So I rapidly switched between the two eyes, which led to a fairly unstable vision. And I'll get to that in a little bit. Suppression is not the ideal way to deal with crossed eyes. The ideal way is to teach the person how to not to uncross the eyes. But it is a way to be able to move through space. You ignore the input from one eye, you depend only on the fixating eye. Now you have a single image, you don't have visual confusion, and you can get around. Many people develop crossed eyes or walled eyes as adults, or due to various factors. And in that situation, they are sometimes left with a constant double vision, a constant sense of two objects, where there really is one. And many learn to cope with this. And I want to read you a section from my book, Fixing My Gaze, about one of my students who had exactly this situation. One of my students, Sarah Murhar, developed a form of strabismus when she was 5 years old and began to experience constant double vision in high school. I wanted to know how she coped, so one day over coffee, I asked Sarah what her view of the world was like. She said, "I see two images, but only one is real. I can be driving and see two images of a car, but I know which one to steer around."
Wow.
And I have to tell you that Sarah did not normally drive. But she did say this. This sounded bizarre, not to mention dangerous, so I asked her how she knew. Sarah thought about this for a moment as she tried to put into words what came automatically to her. Then she said that the car image seen by her right eye was in context. In other words, the right eye image of the car was located relative to other things in her surroundings. To Sarah, it had a defined location in space. She added that in class, she might see two images of me on the blackboard, but again, only the right eye image was real. I was curious. Does my voice come from the image of me seen by the right or left eye? Sarah hesitated, but said that the voice came from the image seen by the right eye. If I were to shake hands with you, she added, I could reach accurately for and shake only the hand seen by the right eye. So she had two images, but she depended on the right eye image. If I tried to use the left eye image, I would miss your hand. It's not that I think about this, I just reach for your hand automatically using the right eye image. I pointed to the coffee cup in front of her. From which of your two coffee cup images does the delicious coffee aroma come from? Now that you mention it, she said, it only comes from the cup image seen by the right eye. So you see what was happening here. She had to construct her reality with these two images. And because she didn't effectively suppress one image as I did, one of my images just simply faded from consciousness. And during my vision therapy, I actually brought it back into awareness. But for her, she had these two constant images. One of them had to be selected as real. That was the image she manipulated. And not only that, but that was the image that got imbued with all the other physical properties, such as smells and sounds. Now you might think this is pretty weird, this real-unreal dichotomy, but we can actually experience it right now. And what I want you to do again is to take your index finger and stick it in front of your face a few inches away, but don't look at it, look at me. And tell me how many images of your finger do you see?
Two.
You have a diplopic image, you have a double image of your finger. This is not abnormal, it's physiological diplopia, and it's based upon the fact that if you're looking at me, your two eyes are bifixating, are aiming at me, and therefore the finger is falling on non-corresponding retinal points, and you're getting the impression of two fingers, right? Now do that again. Look at me, not at the finger, but be aware of the finger. And now take your free hand and try to touch both images of the finger. Very quickly, try to grab both images. Did many of you find that you could only grab one image of the finger? Now you have to keep looking in the distance, because if you look at the finger and aim at it, you're going to make it single again. But many of you should be only able to grab one image of the finger. So your brain has also selected one of those images as real. The image seen by the left eye is the one on the right, and the image seen by the right eye is the one on the left. Okay? So, in that sense, you've experienced the same real-unreal dichotomy that Sarah had to use in order to cope with her double vision. And by the way, she went through optometric vision therapy like I did, and her double vision has resolved. Okay, so the trick then that I had to learn when I went to see a developmental optometrist was how to aim my two eyes at the same place at the same time. Since I was cross-eyed from being a little baby, I had 3 eye surgeries by a very well-known ophthalmic surgeon at Yale New Haven Hospital when I was 2 years old, 3 years old, and 7 years old. And the surgeries made my eyes look straighter. Basically, your eyes are suspended in their orbits by 6 extraocular muscles. And the surgeries basically cut the muscles and reimplant them on the eyeball to move the eye around and also make it harder for me to turn in the eye. So the surgeries made me look more normal. And I actually thought that I had perfect vision until I was in college, because I had 20/20 acuity with both eyes. But the surgeries did not change the way I used my eyes. Because I must have had some problem fusing images from the 2 eyes as a little baby, and therefore suffered from diplopia and visual confusion, I had to find a way to suppress one eye or the other. And a very effective way to suppress an eye is to turn it in. Because if I'm looking at you with my right eye and I turn in the left, then the image that's foveated, that's seen by the fovea of the right eye, is seen in a non-foveal part of the retina of the left eye and can be more easily ignored. Because the non-foveal image will be less well resolved, there are fewer neurons in the brain that are paying attention to it, and so forth. And so I am able to ignore the image seen by the turned eye. And in fact, and I didn't even know this until I was 48 and went to see a developmental optometrist, that despite all my surgeries, I still continue to look with one eye turned in the other. The eye turns were now, for a distance, more subtle. So people didn't notice. But when I looked close, and when you look close and read, nobody really can see where your eyes are, I still had a 15-degree eye turn, which was very interesting because the right eye, let's say, would be looking at the letters on the page. The left eye was turned in by 15 degrees. So the image of the letter was falling on the fovea of the right eye. And where was it falling on the left eye? Does anyone know? 15 degrees is where your blind spot is located. So I had found, the blind spot is a fairly large area, much bigger than the fovea. So I had found a nice adaptation to learn to read, which I finally developed in about 4th grade, which was look with one eye and turn the other eye in by 15 degrees. Sometimes I looked with the right, sometimes the left, but the turned eye was always turned in by 15 degrees. And now I had a way to just simply eliminate the image that's seen by the fovea of one eye, the letter seen by the fovea of one eye, is eliminated in the other eye because that image, that letter is falling on the blind spot of the other eye. Strabismus, turned eyes, is as much an adaptation to, is basically an adaptation to an inability to fuse and merge the images from the two eyes. Why a child has problems initially fusing the images is not understood and may have a multitude of reasons, from maybe a mispositioning of the eyes in the orbits, birth trauma, high fevers, all sorts of ideas have been promoted. But the strabismus itself, the turning in of the eye, is actually an adaptation. And since babies and also adults have a much better ability to turn in the eyes than to turn them out, almost all infants who develop misaligned eyes develop a turned-in eye, an esotropia as opposed to an exotropia. Wall eyes is much more common in the adult population, not among infants. Okay. So, here I am, post-surgery. I've had these 3 surgeries. It's 41 years after my last surgery. I'm 48 years old. I go to see a developmental optometrist. I wasn't asking her for stereo vision. I knew I was stereo blind, and I didn't know it actually until college, and I took a course in neurophysiology and found out that I was stereo blind. And I also had learned at that time that gaining stereo vision was impossible because it had to happen during a critical period in early development. And if you didn't develop stereo vision then, it was impossible. So when I went to see my developmental optometrist, I was not asking her for stereo vision. I wanted a more stable gaze. Because when I looked in the distance, everything jittered. Because I would look with my right eye, then my left eye, then my right eye, then my left eye, and despite the fact that my eyes looked more or less normal, they were still misaligned, not only in the horizontal direction, but in the vertical as well. So the right eye saw several degrees below the left eye. So I was constantly switching between these two views. And as a result, when I was driving and trying to read a road sign, I couldn't keep my eyes on the letters. When my kids were like in the school play and I was in the middle of the auditorium, their faces looked a blur. And I went to an ophthalmologist and I explained the situation, and he tested each eye separately. Very few doctors actually spend much time on binocular vision and stereo vision. And he said, you know, you have 20, I'm slow, you know, I have a low myopia. But with the glasses, that corrects the nearsightedness. He goes, you know, you have 20/20 vision with both eyes. If you think you have a problem, you must have been traumatized by your early surgeries and you need to see a psychiatrist. What? This happens all the time. And so, for the next 8 years, my thought was, forget eye doctors. I don't need to be told this kind of information. And so I basically designed my whole life around minimizing the need to drive. And I stopped looking in the distance where it was most jittery. Only this wasn't a conscious thing. It was sort of unconscious. But one day I was sitting in class, a classroom, or teaching in a classroom, because I teach at Mount Holyoke College, about this size. And my co-teacher said, how come you never call on the kids in the back of the class? And I said, what kids? And she said, it wasn't like I couldn't see them, because I had 20/20 acuity with both eyes. But it was difficult to look in the distance, so I didn't look there. So we came up with a strategy, or she came up with a strategy, where she would stand in the back of the classroom when I was lecturing. And if there was a question in the back of the class, she'd start going like this. And then she would point to the person like this, like this. And then I would go, oh, Jill, what's your question, you know? And I think the students, they're very polite at Mount Holyoke College. They really are a nice group of kids. They never said anything, which I thought was very nice. But it drove me to decide I need to go see another doctor. And I found Teresa Ruggiero, this developmental optometrist in a neighboring town. And she taught me how to aim the two eyes at the same place at the same time. And those are the skills I want to mention to you now. So, what I first did was use a technique called the Brock string, developed by my hero, Frederick W. Brock. Has anyone ever heard of him? Very few people know who he is. He was brilliant, an absolute genius. He understood strabismus better than anybody else, and he developed techniques for it. And he published a lot in the Optometric Weekly of the 1940s, which is why nobody knows of him. But I do have copies of all his papers, and I've read through all of them. So, he came up with a technique among many, many techniques. And by the way, I'm only going to show you 2 techniques that I used in vision therapy. There are many, many others. But these were just 2 that I wanted to highlight. And one is the Brock string. So you all have a string? No bead? You can actually go through the procedure without the bead. But I have more of these. And by the way, you have to get the strings and beads back. I think it's just long.
Really? Oh, you got something?
Okay. Exactly. So this is what I want you to do. Take the string, take the bead, put it at one end of the string. I want you to stretch the bead from the center of your nose out as far as you can. The string may be longer than your arms or slightly shorter, but you get the general idea, like this, right? Put the bead at the end of the string, the far end of the string where you're holding it. And look at the bead. Put the string right in front of you, look at the bead should be straight ahead. How many beads do you see?
One.
Good. How many strings?
2.
You see 2 strings. Why? Because you're fixating on the bead. Your 2 eyes are aiming at the bead. The bead is falling on the same central part of both retinas. But the string, which is in front of the bead, is falling in non-corresponding points of the 2 retinas because it's not in the same plane as the bead. It's in front of the bead. And so you see 2 images of it. The right-eyed image is the string image on your left, and the left-eyed image is the string image on your right. Now take the bead and put it in the middle of the string, somewhere between your nose and the outstretched hand. And look at the bead again. What do you see now?
One bead and
Strings in front,
2
strings in
strings
back.
are crossing.
Yeah. So you might see something like this.
Yeah.
You don't have multiple strings, beads, but here's the bead you're fixating, and you're getting 2 string images coming in and out. Think about the picture I showed you earlier on. What you've got here is the line of sight of both eyes. This is giving you the feedback to know where your 2 eyes are pointing. Now, if you're strabismic like I was, you don't aim the 2 eyes at the same place at the same time. For me to learn how to do that, which is an automatic response that most people have and develop within the first 6 months of life, I did not. If I'm going to learn how to point the 2 eyes at the same place at the same time, I need to know where the 2 eyes are pointing. How am I going to know where they're pointing? The Brock string gave me the feedback to know where the 2 eyes were pointing. This, to me, it was like fantastic. It was just fantastic feedback. It wasn't easy for me at first to do what you're doing now. What I had to do was start with the bead right about an inch from my nose, where people who are cross-eyed do have a little binocularity. Because normally when people look very, very close, their 2 eyes cross in. And so I would start at what Brock would call the centration point, where I could actually make a normal convergence movement and see 1 bead and the X shape around it. If I didn't jiggle the string, there were a whole bunch of different techniques you could use. Use red-green glasses to make the 2 string images look different colors, and so on, to get that double image of the string. And then I would move the bead back a little, and again get the double images, and keep moving it back and back and back, to develop a range over which I could make normal movements of my eyes. Diverge them for looking further, converge them for looking close. The bead and the string gave me the feedback to know. Initially, when I moved the string back, the left eye image of the string was going right into the bead, and the right eye image was faint and somewhere over in the wrong place. But now I had the feedback to know how to move my eyes to get them both pointing at the bead. And then, I didn't just work with a little short string of 1 bead. Eventually, I graduated to an 11-foot string with 5 beads. But early on, and by the way, it took me a year to get to the point where I could do this exercise for 5 feet using 3 different beads. It took a year to master that because, you know, my whole life had been directed toward turning in 1 eye and suppressing it. So to get this new way of seeing took a long time. But fairly early on in my vision therapy, I'd gotten to the point where that vision therapist gave me 2 beads to look at. And she would say, look at the, fixate the close one, now the further one. Now the close one, now the further one. And by the way, moving your finger to and from the bead was a good cue to my brain as to how to move my eyes. And I remember saying to her, to the vision therapist, I feel my eyes moving. I feel them converging to see the close bead and diverging to see the third one. And I can't tell you how exciting that was. I never had that experience before. And after that session, I went out to my car, sat down in the driver's seat, looked at the steering wheel, and it was floating in front of the dashboard. And there was this palpable pocket of space between the steering wheel and the dashboard. I was confused because this was the day after my 48th birthday. And I knew that stereo vision could only develop within the first years of life, and I was more than 40 years past that point. And I thought the sun was setting, it was an odd angle coming into the car, the low light. I must be just having some sort of interesting illusion. And I just told myself to forget about it and drive home. And the next morning, I got up and I did the Brock string and other exercises before going to work, and I sat down in the car and I went to adjust the rear view mirror, and it was floating in front of the windshield. And all that day, my stereo vision began to emerge, sort of intermittently, taking me by total surprise. And it was totally delightful. Light fixtures were floating in midair. Sink faucets were thrusted out toward me. And I remember thinking, I've never seen an arc as beautiful as the arc of that sink faucet. Trees were completely transformed. I could see the layers and layers and layers of depth in amongst the tree branches and leaves. These pockets of space. And I would actually be walking home and immerse myself in the pocket of space that I could now see. Previously, I knew one leaf was in front of another because the leaf in front blocked the leaf behind, but everything was compressed. I didn't have that sense of those volumes of space between things. I had a sense of being immersed in a three-dimensional world because, and you know, the description that I gave to Oliver Sacks that he wrote about in Stereo C was the snowfall. That's how I ended my first letter to him, was that first time I saw snow in 3D. I was rushing out of my building to go grab some food at the deli for lunch. I was moving fast because I was late. And all of a sudden I stopped. The snow was falling in these big, thick flakes. It was a late winter snowfall. And I guess you guys from Phoenix wouldn't relate to this, but it was a late winter snowfall, and I could see each flake in its own space. And all the flakes together were producing this three-dimensional dance, and I had this powerful sense of being immersed in this three-dimensional world, which I had never had before. In the past, the snow would fall in one plane slightly in front of me, and here it was falling all around me. And I completely forgot about lunch. I just stood there in the middle of the campus watching the snow. You know, and I wondered about that. Why is it that stereopsis would have given me this? Because stereopsis, a lot of people say, well, it only works for things right in the fixation plane. You get a better sense of depth right in the fixation plane, right where you're looking. That's not true. Because what happens is you have something called qualitative stereopsis as well. And an image that's located in front or behind the fixation plane, even if it's beyond Panem's fusional area, it can't be fused into one image. Even those images, your brain takes account of the fact that they're falling on disparate parts of the two retinas, non-corresponding points, and says, aha, there's one object there, and it's located in front of or behind the fixation plane. And so you get a sense of that nearerness or furtherness of objects when you can integrate the input from the two eyes. When you point the two eyes at some point in space at the same, some place in space at the same time. And so that whole sense of nearness or furtherness of objects, that space has layers and layers of depth, that space has volume, and that things occupy that space, and that things have volume, and that no two things can be in the same place at the same time. All of these things I knew, but I had never experienced perceptually. And now I was perceiving. And so many people, I just saw a letter to an editor of the Hartford Courant when they aired my story, and the ophthalmologist said, well, you know, stereopsis isn't all that important. It disappears after 8 feet. Well, that is baloney anyway. Large objects are still seen in stereo beyond 8 feet. And it seemed to me I was watching those stereo movies a little bit beyond 8 feet yesterday. But anyway, he completely misses this other property of binocular vision, of this qualitative stereopsis, this sense of the layers and layers of depth. And part of the reason that he misses it, of course, is he's always had stereo vision. And if you've always had it, you can't just close one eye and know what it was like to see as I did. Because your brain will fill in all the stereo information.
You might have been stereo blind too.
I was going to say, can he see?
If he's an ophthalmologist and operating on people's eyes, I sure hope he does. So it was an incredible revelation to me how much I had been missing. And I have to say this. My husband's an astronaut. He's flown in space 3 times. This is an image, this is a picture of when the shuttle blasted off. This was in January of 1996 on his first mission, and that was at 4 in the morning. It was a night launch. It was absolutely spectacular. All his launches were spectacular. And I gotta say this, it was fantastic watching him blast off into space, but it pales in comparison to seeing in stereo. So the last thing I want to show you, the last technique, has to do with these Polaroid vectograms. Because when a person like me starts to use disparity cues, you know, now I'm looking through the 2 retinas together, and the objects are falling on disparate parts of the 2 retinas, and I'm judging where they are in space. I had to find a way to calibrate my newfound sense of stereo, this newfound disparity cues, with my old ways of seeing the world. You know, I used to come up with depth. There we go, sort of. It's not wildly in focus, but it actually doesn't matter too much. I had to calibrate my new disparity cues, my new stereo cues, with my old ways of judging depth, like object occlusion, or perspective, or shading and shadows. How was I going to do that? It's not immediately apparent to somebody like me how to use these cues. And an example of that is, if I looked in the mirror, I remember the day, it was several years after my stereo first emerged, when I went, oh my goodness, my reflection's not at the plane of the mirror. My reflection is inside the mirror, behind the mirror. You know, those sort of things, all these sort of things were a total revelation to me. Looking outside a window, the background is not pasted flat onto the frame of the window, but instead is in layers and layers of depth beyond it. I had to find out how to use my disparity cues to create these sort of visual impressions. And one way that's very effective is with these Polaroid vectograms. So this is where you need the Polaroid glasses. And what we're going to do is, basically, there are 2 Polaroid images here. And if you close one eye and then you close the other, you'll see that one image is seen by one eye, one by the other, right? I should put it far apart so you can't see it. Now we put it together, and if I then take these vectograms and move them apart, so for example, I move them like this, so the right eye image is going over toward the left, and the left eye image is going over toward the right. What's happening to the rolled circle? It's coming toward you?
Yep.
Is it changing its size?
No.
I don't remember. You can see its size change. So here it is, overlap. Now I'm going to move it.
Getting
Closer.
smaller.
It's getting smaller as it's coming closer. Now we'll go the other way. Here it is, overlapping. the right eye image is going to the right, the left eye image is going to the left. You have to divert your eyes. What's happening to the,
Could you put it at the other end of the projector so it's higher on the screen? There.
yeah, that's better. Sorry.
Thank you.
What's happening now?
Getting bigger.
Bigger.
Getting bigger, and is it moving in
Further
depth?
away.
To infinity and beyond.
I can test all your fusion ranges. Find out when it
Good
doubles for you. Okay? So does anyone have any inkling as to why the rope circle gets smaller or larger as it moves in depth?
Because if it's closer,
Because of
it must
the-
be smaller to appear the same size.
Exactly. And that's called size constancy. So in truth, when you're looking at those rope circles, even though it appears to be coming closer to you, in reality, it isn't. And the image, the size of the image on your retina is not changing. But if that rope circle really was coming closer to you, it would take up more of your retina. And your brain then, if it didn't compensate for that, the rope circle would appear to be larger in size as it came closer. And so the brain compensates for that by saying, okay, the rope circle is smaller.
What did
Okay.
you call that?
Pardon?
What did you call that?
Size constancy. And similarly, when something moves further away, it shrinks on your retina. And so to keep the size constant, the brain creates the impression that the image is larger. Well, here, you're being fooled because you think the object is coming closer, your brain makes it look smaller, but in truth, the object hasn't changed its size on your retina. That the optometrists call SILO, for small in, large out. And it's a good way to determine whether a patient is really using disparity cues. This non-corresponding positions on the two retinas to know about seeing in depth. Because if you're using the disparity cues, you will report those size changes, as well as the float. It's floating toward me, it's floating away from me. And so if the patient can report those two changes in the proper direction, then the optometrist is getting some idea that they are beginning to use their retinal disparity cues to interpret the world. And those were some of the things that I really had to work on. And one of the ways I worked on that, this was something I came up with myself, is I took a string. I didn't even have beads on it. I just took a string and I suspended it across my dining room, using the bars on the window and a music stand and threads going up to the ceiling, so that if you walked into my dining room, you saw this string just suspended there, the string parallel to the floor and the ceiling. And then what I would do is I would take these point vectograms and I'd put on my Polaroid glasses and I would slide the vectograms so the circle should be appearing to move away from me while I'm looking down the string. Well, you see what this did is the place where the string image crossed is where my eyes were aiming, right? Like when you were looking at the bead. The place where the string image crossed is where my eyes were aiming, and that's where the fused image of the right circle should be. And by doing those sort of exercises, I was able to calibrate where I was aiming my eyes with where I thought this stereo target was located. And it was only after I was doing those sort of exercises and really getting that, and it took several weeks to really get it to work, that I began to notice my reflection, not at the plane of the mirror, but behind the mirror, and so on and so forth. Okay? So those are examples of some of the exercises that I did, and I think I'll stop talking now. Anyone would like them, and I'll autograph them, and so on and so forth. Yeah?
I had wandering eye when I was a kid, had
Right.
it operated in 1962 to correct it, so I can see 3D, but I was told that and I kind of experienced it because they put a patch on my eye when
Right.
I was like 4 or 5, and I was like bumping into everything. I was
Right.
told that your brain basically turns it off if it can't, I don't know if I was going to a blind spot, or I had no concept of that, but I was told the brain just kind of ignores it and
Right.
throws it away.
Right.
Is that
And
basically what
to say it
happened?
throws it away, you're still probably using some peripheral information from the turned eye.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, the lazy eye or amblyopia which can be a result of strabismus or very different refractive values in the two eyes, is a result of you can't fuse the images from the two eyes, and so you have to ignore one, and the ignored eye becomes the lazy eye. And there are many vision therapy techniques to work on that. In
Right.
addition to the ones I just mentioned, things where what you do is, the trouble with patching is that you patch the good eye to force the brain to use the weak eye. And that makes sense, but it's doing nothing for binocularity. And because most ophthalmologists don't think binocular vision is all that important, they don't seem to care about that.
Right.
And so that does nothing for binocularity. And so what you really have to learn through therapy, if in your case it sounds like it all worked out fine,
Yeah.
but for a lot of people, what they have to learn through therapy is how to use their weak eye when their strong eye is also open, when it's not patched. And so you can do experiments, like here's one where you put a red-green glasses on a person, and they have to play a game where a red light goes on, and they have to touch it, and then that red light goes off, and another red light comes on the board someplace else. You touch that, and so on and so forth, and you try to do as many touches as you can in a certain amount of time. You put red-green glasses on the person. Only the weak eye, let's say the eye behind the red lens, can see the red light. The other eye, let's say the good eye, still has the view of the world. It's a greenish view, but it still has a view of the world. But it's now being disadvantaged for this task. That's the reverse of what happens in amblyopia and lazy eye. Now you're making the lazy eye the eye that has to do the difficult task, while the other eye just sort of gives you a general idea of the world. So you switch the balance between them, and those are ways to learn to integrate that information. No ophthalmologist knows about these techniques. They're called monocular fixation and binocular field, and that's why you need to go to a developmental optometrist to find it. They'll just patch.
Yeah.
Yeah?
So the conventional wisdom is that, I missed the beginning of the talk, but I understand it to be that if you're 3 or 4 months old, that's when you learn the stereoscopic.
Right, that's when you gain stereo, or when your brain starts to pay
But
attention
your
to
experience now debunks that a little bit, or at least, do you think you went through the same process just at age 48 or whatever?
Yeah, I think what happened is this. There have been a study of 4,543 newborn babies, and none of them were cross-eyed at birth. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because the fovea is not well developed at birth, so your vision is very blurry at birth, or what we would consider blurry, 2800 vision. So what do you need good eye alignment for if you don't have a fovea anyway? At about 3 to 4 months of age, several things happen. Babies get good at making convergence movements, turning in the eyes for seeing close, and so on. At that age, the fovea starts to develop, so that acuity in the two eyes goes way up. And it's at that age, at around 12 weeks of age, where babies first appear to see in stereo.
But it took you much longer. It took you a year, you said, just to get into the first, what?
Right. So that's what happens naturally. Now, for some reason, I couldn't fuse when the brain started to pay attention to the two eyes at the same time, and it couldn't fuse, I went into a strabismic way of seeing instead of the normal binocular way of seeing. But that means that my visual system started out normally. I started out with probably a normal complement of binocular neurons in my brain, stereo sensing neurons in my brain. But then those circuits had to be inhibited so that I could have a single view of the world, so I only looked through one eye. So I had a sort of latent binocularity that just sort of sat there for 48 years. And it was only after I learned to put my eyes in the same place that those circuits could be revived. And I think that's generally true for strabismics, because if you read the literature, you'll find that most strabismics do have areas, ways where they see binocularly, in the peripheral visual field, for example. They have some latent binocularity, but until they're taught how to move the two eyes, it's never going to be more than that.